Hello again. Thursday marks the 109th anniversary of one of the biggest maritime disasters of all time. Now a documentary is out, shedding light on a group of passengers whose stories were nearly forgotten. Well, CGTN's Francis Koh is here. Tell us more about this, Francis.
Gerald, this is just a fascinating story. Of course, the story that you were talking about is the Titanic, the sinking more than a century ago. Now, in the early hours of April 15, 1912, the massive British passenger liner struck an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It never made it to its destination of New York. More than 1,500 passengers and crew died, mostly from drowning in the freezing waters. Around 700 did survive, among them 6 Chinese passengers, a fact that has been little known until now, thanks to a new documentary being released in China on Friday called The Six.
Just head out for the horizon whenever I feel like it.
Jack and Rose's fictional love story in the Titanic brought the very real sinking of the ship to the big screen. Now a new documentary is out, The Six, about 6 particular passengers who boarded that ill-fated ocean liner. You've probably never heard of their names before: Li Bing, Fang Lang, Chang Chip, A Lam, Cheng Fu, and Ling He.
They deserve to tell their story as much as any other survivors do.
The 6 were among 8 Chinese nationals aboard, paying passengers on their way to New York, then to Cuba for work. When the ship struck the iceberg, they were stuck in 3rd class on the lowest decks with little chance of surviving. Against the odds, all 6 of them survived. Most escaped in lifeboats. One was found clinging to a piece of debris.
He may have been the last one that was saved. That became the inspiration for how Rose was saved.
But their incredible fortune would end there. They were swiftly detained and prevented from entering the United States. The reason? The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, banning Chinese laborers from the country. The racism fueled by that law wiped away the stories of those Chinese passengers.
Titanic, it is a Chinese story. They were kind of shuffled off and hidden, kind of expunged from the records and so on.
Only to be revived more than a century later with The Six. A story unknown to the world, unknown even to their descendants.
Looking back on them, what kind of feelings do you have towards them now?
I think it's just gratitude.
Titanic director James Cameron is the executive producer of The Six, and Arthur Jones is the director. He joins us now from Shanghai. Arthur, it is such a pleasure to talk to you. I reached out to you more than 2 years ago. It is just incredible when I first heard about this. It has been a long time coming. Take us back and tell us how you first heard about this incredible story.
Well, I was just finishing off a different documentary at the time and working with my friend and collaborator, Stephen Schwankert, who's a maritime historian. I'm not. And he told me the story. He mentioned just the sort of the headline. There were 6 Chinese survivors of Titanic. And at first I thought, well, maybe I don't know this because I'm not Chinese, even though I spend a lot of time and live in China. But it turned out to be true, and it seemed that no one in China knew it. And that began a fascinating journey that's taken us 5 years to complete.
Since there wasn't much of a paper trail, not a lot of records on these passengers, you and your team really had to play detective in a sense. How did you manage to piece all these stories together?
I mean, think of a way you might do it. We've probably tried that way. We've been to archives and libraries. We've pretty much doorstep people. Both Steve and I have a background in journalism, and I think it was a combination of historian skills and genealogist skills and journalism that brought us to finding, I think, pretty much everything that can be found about them.
How did these passengers survive? I mean, they had so much against them. They were on the lowest decks, and it was such a harried situation. How did they manage to do that?
Well, they were professional sailors. They weren't working as sailors on board Titanic. They were passengers. But we believe the evidence suggests that they were able to get to the boat decks much quicker than most third-class passengers, and they did that through a combination of luck. I think it always required luck to survive Titanic, but a lot of savvy, a lot of skill and knowledge. They sort of followed their noses up to the top decks, going a different route than most of the third-class passengers who tended to be gathered towards the stern of the ship and then stayed there too long. They got on the deck quickly, and then they looked for opportunities to get into boats that had empty places in them, in lifeboats.
And you know, this story has not been known to most of the world, and even to the descendants of these survivors had no idea. So how did they react, and what was it like to meet them in person and share these stories with them?
Well, that was the biggest privilege of all. You know, a privilege of a lifetime, really, for a documentary maker. They were humble. They were always uncertain whether the inklings of an idea that they might be related to Titanic. They were always uncertain about it, and I think what we were trying to do was help them to complete that story so that they could talk about it with friends and other family. It's amazing how we've managed to go 109 years without the Chinese descendants talking about it, because this is a story that I mean, when I was a kid, I knew a Titanic descendant. She lived in my village, and everyone knew who she was, and she was interviewed regularly by the press and so on. So these are normally people who have a story to tell, and they're not normally reticent to tell it. But in this case, for lots of historical reasons and family reasons, they didn't tell the story, even if they knew it, which some didn't.
Where are these families now? Are they sort of spread out all over the world?
Well, we know there are families in the U.S. That we tracked one of the stories through to Canada. We believe that 2 or 3 of the survivors actually made it back to Asia, and by about 1920, so 8 years after the sinking of Titanic. And we know there are relatives of some of them in the south of China, in Guangdong, in a particular area called Taishan, and we were able to track them back to there. So pretty much spread out all over the place. In some cases, they were not able to settle because of discriminatory immigration laws. So most of the survivors who were in England for a while ended up leaving in a sort of mass, fairly secretive deportation that happened after the First World War.
You know, speaking of racism, the racism that they dealt with, unfortunately, has parallels with what we're dealing with now, with anti-Asian, hate around the world. What does it feel like to have this documentary have even more resonance today, and have parallels with what happened more than a century ago?
Well, of course, from the beginning of the project, there were problems in this story that we needed to overcome, and one was that they were so badly talked of in the days after the sinking, as if they had done something terribly wrong. The media, some of the media in the US and particularly the UK, wrote about them as if they were stowaways. They were described as having dressed as women in order to save themselves and get on lifeboats. So we went back to basics to look at those claims and to work out if there was any truth. And we promised ourselves if there was some truth to it, we would say it. There was no point in hiding it. But as we examine those claims, it's interesting that we all know what's happened in the world in the last couple of years, that the issue of Asian hate, violence towards Asians, and general discrimination has come to the fore. And the parallels were extraordinary. I mean, as we looked through, we found that a lot of the types of discrimination have reemerged in the same form. It's not legal anymore or about immigration, certainly in most countries, but the parallels were remarkable.
Arthur, I could talk to you forever. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for talking with us. Good luck with your release in China, and hope to see it here in the U.S. as well. Thank you so much, Arthur.
You should do. Thank you. Thank you.